Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Maurizio Caschetto, the editor of the Legacy of John Williams podcast. I'm very happy today to present this very, very special celebration for the music of two of the greatest Hollywood film composers, Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams. And in doing so, I'm together with the partners from the Goldsmith Odyssey. I introduce Yavar Moradi. Hello, Yavar, and thank you for being here with us.
Hello, I'm glad I can hear everyone now. Thanks for your patience.
David Lichty. Hello, David, and thank you for being here.
Hi.
Also, we have here from United Kingdom, Tim Burton. Hello, Tim.
Good to see you all. How are you?
And also we have Mr. Daniel Champion, who is the guy who's actually the reason for why we are all here. So, Daniel, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
And we have a tremendous list of panelists. So I'll start with David Newman. Hello, Dave, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we from St. Louis, we have Mr. Leonard Slatkin. Hello, Leonard.
Good to be with you.
Again, from Los Angeles, instead, we have a very fine composer and conductor, Miss Leanna Primiani. Hello, Leanna, and thank you for being here.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we also have some of great collaborators of both Jerry and John. I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Bruce Botnick, who's a fantastic recording engineer from Los Angeles. Hello, Bruce.
Hello. Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm very happy to introduce also Mr. Mike Lang. Hello, Mike, and thank you for being here.
Hello.
And then we have Mr. Mike Matessino from Los Angeles. Hello, Mike, and thank you for being here with us too.
Buongiorno, Maurizio, and hi, everybody. Great to be here again.
And again, from Los Angeles, we have film music author and writer Jeff Bond. Hello, Jeff, and thank you for being here.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm now unmuted.
I would like to Daniel Champion to introduce why you thought about this, this celebration of Jerry and John, and how you came up with this idea.
First of all, thank you very much, Mauricio, and also thank you, Yavar, for taking such a bold lead on this project. I mean, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So you should be commended. Also to the esteemed panel of guests that we have here, it's an honor to be sitting with such a group of experienced professionals, and I'm grateful to all of you for giving your time to this. I suppose if I may, then I'll briefly introduce the Ipswich Film Theatre and our role in this project. The Film Theatre was established in 1975 as a regional hub, really, for independent and foreign language film, and it quickly cemented its reputation among cinephiles, students of cinema throughout the region, with bold programming and investment in local filmmakers and documentarians, and by offering films that encourage discourse, many of which couldn't really be found in the mainstream multiplexes. We also have a history of regular filmmaker Q&As. Thelma Schoonmaker, Ray Harryhausen being two extraordinary artists who we've welcomed to the stage over the years. But the IFT never had its own festival. So it was in late 2019 that we began discussing the possibility of an annual film music festival to sort of celebrate those who've worked in the industry and continue to work in the industry. And I suppose to engage young cinema goers and young music students with the art form. For those of you who don't know, our region has a pretty decent independent musical scene and independent music scene, really. We felt that with the involvement of well-respected educational artistic partners that we have in the region, that there was something very special to be developed. So we started to put programming ideas together, wish lists of guests we wanted to invite. And then 2020 happened, and everything changed for all of us. And those plans were scaled back considerably, hopefully just in the medium term. But the passion we had to launch this festival with the John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith event remained sort of very important to us. So I suppose when I approached Maurizio with the idea of putting an online birthday event together, I was delighted that he instantly agreed that this was really something that he would like to be involved in. So I brazenly left the logistics up to him, and I suppose once he had contacted Yavar, and then the project just really started to take shape, and this is the result. So I mean, I didn't dare dream that we would assemble such a crew, but I think it's a testament to, I suppose, the love that clearly exists for the work of these two men, that I think so many of you have given your time for this. So thank you all so much. And let's have a great hour or so talking about them.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for giving us this opportunity. And I'd like to give word now to Yavar, to start the conversation. And we'd like to give also a historical and perspective about the both figure of Jerry and John. Of course, it's a daunting to reduce these two giants to just an hour of talking, but we'll try to focus on some very interesting points, that because their career, as much as they were very different composers stylistically, in terms of style and voice, they had also lots of things in common. So Yavar, why don't you lead the first question and you open up the conversation?
I thought we'd start with you, Leonard, because you've, I believe, met Jerry earlier than anyone else here. I think you told me in our conversation a couple of years ago that it was during the 50s your parents had him over for dinner or something like that. And of course, you didn't tell me what time you met John, because it was a Jerry Goldsmith conversation. But can you speak now about your earliest memories of interacting with both of them and meeting them early in their careers?
And very early in mine, in fact, before I had a career. Because my parents were so involved in the music and the film industry, they worked with pretty much everyone. And I was interested that you want to put this in a historical context, because I was trying to think about perhaps another link between the two of them. I knew them when they kind of were starting out. John certainly as a pianist, before we knew he was going to be taking off in the writing world. And Jerry was a little bit older, I think maybe by 3 years, than John. And he didn't come in the performance end as much as we thought. But my parents had everybody over to the house, and we got to know everyone because my mom and dad would serve as their concertmaster and first cellist quite often. Less so with John, because my father had passed away already in 1963. But in both cases, my parents tried to be discriminating about who came to the house. Not everybody got invited to the conclaves. I think my parents were particularly pleased because they could talk about things other than what they did in the film world. They both had incredibly broad interests, broad tastes in music. They were well-read, and they were both very kind to both me and my brother. I spent a lot of time with Jerry and eventually commissioned him to write a piece, played music of his. John, I've known, it really does seem like forever. But the other historic thing that I think is interesting is that John and Jerry kind of represent the start of a certain generation of composers for films. They come after the initial Americans, like an Alfred Newman or Alex North, Ernest Gold, and before the more current crop. So we place them as being the bridge. I think their place in history needs to be judged by who else was composing at the time and how the film studios developed, collapsed, and then came back in a different way. I think both of them are extraordinary figures, and sometimes it's undervalued, their contribution, just in the sense of history.
You have another really important link to both of them in that you three shared a composition teacher, Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco. And I was wondering if, you could give some insight through that experience into their early compositional training, as you shared the same teacher.
Tedesco virtually taught all the composers who wrote for films back in the 40s and 50s into the 60s. He had a house in Beverly Hills, small, and he himself apparently wrote more than 200 scores, but a lot of them are probably uncredited. He came to the States already very well established as a composer, particularly in opera and writing works for the guitarist Andrei Segovia. When you studied with him, you were in a very formalized world of classical composition. You had to write one fugue every week. He had mimeographed exercises that we all had to do. But he was a kind man. He was very understanding about the mistakes you made and tried to steer you on the right path. But he was also an old school disciplinarian. And I think that's part of what characterizes John and Jerry, as well as other people who studied with him. They came to this with really an immense background from Tedesco.
Leonard, I got a quick question. Do you know of or know Ernst Krenek?
Yes.
Because Jerry said he was one of his teachers too.
Yes. A lot of people study with Krenek. There's another composer who kind of fell off the radar and became more well known as a teacher. But Krenek, as opposed to Tedesco was kind of interested in old fashioned. He actually had a letter from Schoenberg where Schoenberg says that he never thought the 12-tone system would truly catch on like it did, and he was a little shocked at it. Tedesco went the other way. He wanted to be very much romantic. Krenek, on the other hand, embraced the new direction music was going. And I would think that if you studied with him, I didn't know him. I knew his music, and I knew who he was. But if you didn't know Krenek, you could certainly tell the people who studied with him had probably a more expanded range of melodic and harmonic thinking, I would think.
Leonard, may I ask, since you studied with him as well, did Tedesco, in addition to teaching craft and technique, did he, since you said he taught most of the film composers at the time, did he focus on the emotions of music and the things that music accomplishes?
Yes. He said, actually, it's something we should all remember. He said that generally we tend to break music down into three categories: harmony, rhythm, and melody. And he said, but there's a fourth that's really the most important, and that is individuality. He was always trying to, through the means of the classical teaching, try to find where the composers were with their own voice. Sometimes difficult for those who are writing for film, who have to be locked into whatever the screen says it has to be, perhaps a kind of sound, a style. But he wanted his composers in training to truly go out. And that's the other thing, of course, that characterizes not only John and Jerry, but so many of the greats. No matter what style they're writing in, who wrote the score. And that's what Tedesco really tried to imprint on all of us. I'm one of the few who came out with no compositional style. I just borrow from the very best. And
in this sense, to continue to keep on this historical context, I would like to bring in Dave Newman, because I'd love to ask him about the pivotal importance of the 20th century Fox environment in which your father, Alfred, but also your uncle, Lionel, really took so many younger composers and gave them opportunities to shine, basically. So how much important was that for both Jerry and John, and how much was that collegial environment that was there important to establish their own singular voices as composers?
Well, Alfred Newman worked from the beginning, from 1930 through 39 at UA. Basically, he worked for Goldwyn. And he pretty much had carte blanche. He could do anything he wanted. Then he moved in 39 to about 59 to Fox, where again, he basically could do anything he wanted. And I think Zanuck was kind of a Luddite with music, as a lot of them were, but Alfred Newman, I think, tried to little by little expand his horizons, but also I think he was in a unique position to help people. And I guess he could spot talent, and he liked to help young composers. And for whatever reason, I don't know where he learned how to do this. He could just wield power well. If he wanted to get somebody a job that he thought would help their career, he could just do it, kind of carte blanche. It didn't matter. And I know John played piano. I think, I don't know when he started at Fox, maybe 54, 55. I think he started when Carousel or around that time. And John told me a story that his first session at Fox, he was very nervous. He was playing piano. You could go an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever, and you could have a break of a half an hour. It wasn't unionized the way that it is now. And John said that Alfred Newman at the break came and sat with him the entire break and just chatted with him. Didn't really talk necessarily about music, but just sat down and chatted with them. And he said he so appreciated that. So I don't know. I don't know intrinsically if how much Alfred Newman had to do with this sort of environment. And to what Leonard said, there's just nothing like Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams that were so hegemonic in the last part of the 20th century. It's kind of unique. And they really did. I mean, I know they studied with the same teacher, but Jerry really was a modernist at heart, and John is a populist at heart. But they kind of met in the middle, because when you're doing film scoring, no matter how individual you want to be, there's a film, and you have to collaborate with a thing. So there's just no way of getting around what it is that you need to do. And the other thing I'll say is, I think the 60s are a really interesting time. So we're in post-World War II, new music. You're in Boulez, you're in this incredibly dogmatic serial universe where they're not only serializing notes, they're serializing rhythm and harmony, and not harmony, and dynamics, and this really thing. And then you've got this film music, and they all think it's crap. They all talk about how horrible film music is. And these guys just sort of develop in this area, and they're just hegemonic. And John's still going. Jerry, if he hadn't passed away, would probably still be working as well. But once you got to Star Wars, it just was completely different. But from like the 60s to about 76, they were doing a lot of experimenting and interesting stuff. And there was all those interesting Goldsmith films and all those interesting John Williams films. So that just got kiboshed because of Star Wars and the blockbuster thing. And then that's the story, Jeff, that you tell about Star Trek. Star Trek to me was the time where Jerry just realized, I have to do a Star Wars theme. I can't do what I would have done with a film like that in the 60s. I can't do Sand Pebbles, or I can't do Planet of the Apes, or I have to do a Star Wars score, essentially.
This era of Fox in the 60s is something I love talking about. Yavar knows this from our last conversation about Jerry's first score there not long ago, Take Her, She's Mine. But do you recall in 1997 when they rededicated the scoring stage as the Newman stage very properly, and John spoke, what he said about his first time on that stage? Do you recall that?
I don't recall. What did he say?
He actually was first there in 1938. Came with his father out from New York because the Raymond Scott Quintet, of which John Sr. was a member, a percussionist, was playing source music for Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and John was sent to play with Shirley Temple in her playground. So that's how far back that goes. And you were right about Carousel. He actually orchestrated some bars of the ballet sequence. And if you know what his arranging style is, you can actually pick them out. The interesting thing is how Bad News actually led to a whole generation of film score community that is still going on today, which was one when Alfred left Fox, which was devastating news at the time. And then you had the problems at the studio centered around Cleopatra, which basically brought the studio to its knees and it just about closed its doors. Lionel came in and was sort of charged with rebuilding this music department there. he got John and Jerry. Alex North was there, who was, of course, very important to Jerry, particularly as a mentor. The orchestrators, Alexander Courage and Herbie Spencer and Arthur Morton, who both worked, Arthur Morton mainly with Jerry, Herbie many, many years with John, Sandy Courage. You had, the music editors, Kenny Hall and Ken Wanberg, who again worked with Jerry and John respectively for decades. So can you imagine all of these people there at the same time? Henry Mancini, Andre Previn, Leslie Brickus and Ian Fraser there doing Dr. Dolittle, all of them there at the same time. And if I could go back in time, that's always something I would love to do, because we've always heard the stories about Lionel kind of having drinks in his office at the end of every day with all these people. Can you imagine just all of them there at one studio at the same time? And it all came out of sort of the calamity of a studio that was not doing well. The Sound of Music basically saved it, brought it back. And that just sort of led to everything that came afterwards. We're all here talking about all these great scores and a whole great generation of film music just because of what happened there. I always saw it as sort of like the ground zero of the what we call the silver age of film music.
There is a lovely picture that the great flutist Sheridan Stokes shared with me when I talked with him for my own podcast, which he was the youngest contract players in Hollywood back then in the mid-50s, and there is this beautiful picture of him which got a notice to be drafted in the army while he was playing the 20th Century Fox Orchestra, and you can see this very small picture of him together with Leonard Newman and Alfred Newman, and I think there is also Leonard's father Felix in that picture, and it's so lovely because you can see a kind of musicianship, a kind of bonding and collegiality that probably is not anymore in film music today.
Well, we don't have cases where studio systems bring various composers together and offices adjoining and that sort of thing. I mean, some of these composers have told stories about sneaking into the other's recording session, and because it's just right near the office, and seeing what they're writing and having them see what you're writing. That's an environment which the studio system, I think, kind of allowed, that isn't around the same way today.
I think it'll be a good time to bring Jeff Bond and Mike Matessino in to talk about television. If we look at the timeline of both Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams, when there's a wonderful happenstance, almost like a bookend, thinking to the Irwin Allen collaboration, because you have one of the best main title sequences and scores with the Towering Inferno by John Williams, and then you have this fantastic, triumphant end title to The Swarm with Jerry Goldsmith, and it's kind of a wonderful, bookend there. But before those big cinematic scores, there was the TV aspect to Irwin Allen. So Jeff and Mike, chat to us about their very seminal TV work.
Goldsmith was known, and talked so much about doing live television and how that was this incredible crucible for him that taught him to do so much on the fly and kind of generate so much music and be able to change music in a tiny amount of time. What he didn't really talk about as much was all the radio he had done before that. He had done probably at least 60, probably far more than that, radio programs, starting, right at the beginning of the 50s, and up through the late 50s, early 60s, when he was working on these live television programs. So, for a composer, 60 shows, that's like an entire career. He had worked so much that he had honed his, skill set and his voice incredibly by the time he started actually working in television. And, he and Williams both worked at Fox. They both did television at Fox under Lionel Newman. Jerry was a little bit older and was kind of more ahead. He had a faster start in terms of theatrical films than Williams, although they were both doing them at the same time. Jerry was doing bigger projects in the 60s. Right away, he was doing, Freud with John Huston and Lonely Are the Brave, and eventually doing big movies at Fox, like The Blue Max or The Sand Pebbles. Williams was mostly doing comedies at that time. He did do some westerns and dramas, but by far the most he was doing in terms of theatrical films were comedies. But the Irwin Allen connection is really important because John Williams got to do these science fiction shows for Irwin Allen that had these amazing title sequences. Irwin Allen's whole kind of shtick at Fox was to bring movie quality visuals and action to television. And this was at a time, as Mike was talking about, right after Cleopatra, when Fox didn't have a lot going on in terms of theatrical films, but their television department was really growing. And Irwin Allen kind of figured out how to use all the trappings of the studio to make his TV shows look like movies. So, Williams got to do scores for Lost in Space and the Time Tunnel, Land of the Giants, that had all this scope, and that really laid a lot of the groundwork for what he would wind up doing on kind of his later blockbuster movies. And then, Irwin Allen, you move from television into movies. He made this big gamble on making the Poseidon Adventure, which Fox and nobody else really wanted to make, but Irwin Allen turned it into this very exciting production. And because he loved working with Williams on his TV series, he brought Williams in to do Poseidon Adventure. Williams had already, I think, won an Oscar for adaptation for Fiddler on the Roof, and gotten some other Oscar nominations for that kind of work. And he was starting to do these kind of more prestige films like The Reavers and some Robert Altman movies. But the Poseidon Adventure is what positioned John Williams to be the blockbuster composer. And he wound up doing Towering Inferno. Poseidon Adventure and Towering Inferno were the biggest money-making films in history when they were released. They were the Star Wars and Jaws of their day, before Star Wars and Jaws. So Williams was in the position then to work with Spielberg and do all these gigantic franchises. Goldsmith had worked with Irwin Allen. He had scored an episode of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which was a show that Irwin Allen did. But Irwin Allen didn't like the theme music that Jerry wrote. It was so experimental. It was just this weird, strange sounding piece of music. And Goldsmith said that Irwin Allen came up to him on the stage and said, "That might be your music, your kind of music, but it's not mine." But he did respect Goldsmith, and Goldsmith had a great career, and Irwin hired him later to do The Swarm. But by that time, it was the end, really, of Irwin Allen's career, and the business had been taken over by a whole different kind of filmmaking that Spielberg had demonstrated with Jaws, and then Star Wars. So those were the projects that Williams would be working on, and Goldsmith would have it kind of a parallel career.
It seemed like he had kind of bad luck sometimes, because Irwin Allen collaborated with John Williams on Poseidon Adventure and Towering Inferno, and then Jerry got brought in on The Swarm, as you said, at the end of that ended the string of successes.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, and not to belabor this, but another interesting thing is that Poseidon Adventure happened right after Shaft, about a year after, and Goldsmith had kind of a series of events that kind of hurt his career right after he did Patton. He did Patton, which was one of his greatest scores and a huge success. It was Oscar nominated. But then after that, there was a composer's strike. This movie Shaft came out, and it was so popular that people wanted hear pop funk style scores in the early 70s. So a lot of composers were not getting work. Many others, kind of suffered this in addition to Goldsmith, but because Williams, I think, had done Poseidon Adventure, and he was already, kind of on a roll in the early 70s, whereas Goldsmith had to kind of go back to television for the first few years of the 70s. He did tons of television work around that period, and by that point, Williams had already kind of ascended to much more of an A-list composer status and was getting much bigger projects during that period.
Jerry, as you pointed out earlier, Jeff, about his work in radio, had such a discipline because of that, and because of he could just write brilliant scores very quickly and get them done for television. And of course, he did famously the Twilight Zone episodes. So he really, really made his mark, and kind of like his renown was already there. John had sort of a different experience because he had the perspective of being a studio session pianist. So he would play for various composers like Dmitri Tiomkin and different, for other studios like Columbia and so forth. He did like the rehearsal. He was the rehearsal pianist for Audrey Hepburn on Funny Face. And so he had the position of being in the orchestra, looking at the composer / conductor, and the idea in his mind that, hey, I can do that, and observing. And so he sort of gained the ability to do that by being in the orchestra. And then he was under the wing of Stanley Wilson at Universal first, doing tons of television there. And so I think that Lionel certainly would have looked at that. And I think this speaks to both Lionel's ability to find the talent for his stable at a music department, in conjunction with the new management of 20th Century Fox, when Daryl Zanuck retook the studio from the board of directors side and put his son Richard Zanuck as the production head. And Richard was charged with getting a stable of producers to work at the studio, Irwin Allen being one of them, Arthur Jacobs being another critical one, to have people on the lot who were making sort of a stream of product for the studio. So those two things sort of happening in conjunction with each other was all, again, part of rebuilding this studio and a stable of talent on the production side. And of course, when producers find composers that they like, they're going to stick with them. And so John got very lucky by being asked by Irwin to do those themes for all those shows. And then it sort of led, as you said, into the branching into features. But I think being shepherded by the heads of the departments, first Stanley and Lionel.
And in this sense, I'd like to bring Mike Lang into the conversation, because you came to know both Jerry and John when you were very young, a young pianist in LA, a studio musician, and you played with them for decades. And I would love to ask you, before asking you about the first time you met both Jerry and John, how much important is to you their training as pianists? Because we all know that John is a very excellent pianist, but also Jerry, because Jerry, if I remember well, studied with the great pianist Jacob Gimple in LA. So, Michael, how much important was their training to establish their voice as composers?
Boy, my mind is spinning. As an opening question, how to answer that. It's a two-edged sword. I think that's what it is. Because if you go in and they write something, you have trouble with it. You don't have much wiggle room to talk about it, because they're a great pianist and they know how to write for the piano. So, hopefully, you don't have that. I would say up until a few days ago, I would have thought that John was capable of being more challenging with what he would ask a pianist to play at the most bold times, when he wrote things that were difficult. I'm thinking of the piano solo to E.T., which Ralph Grierson played so well. It was a very challenging part, and I've talked to Ralph about it. He wasn't sure he could play it, and John was saying, "Sure you can, baby," it was that kind of thing. One of you sent these early Goldsmith scores, and I heard this piano solo that Jerry had written for John to play. And it's, unfortunately, the mix isn't so great from a piano point of view. And it's, it's got some pedal in it, there's a lot of moving parts, but it's a considerable piano solo and it goes on for a considerable amount of time. And John played it so beautifully. So, I mean, it's always better to work with people who know what they're doing. So to work for either of those people, there's no issue. People say, what are the most challenging moments? And I think this is part of it, but I think the most challenging moment is when you go in and work for someone who doesn't know how to write, and certainly doesn't know how to write for piano, and you're looking something that is literally unplayable, and you have to figure out how to fix it, and how to make it work. And so you do.
Do you think their training as musicians, kind of aided their relationships with studio musicians when they were acting as composers? Like, was it a helpful thing in terms of connecting that way?
I think for sure. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing, there's so much pressure when you're recording, not so much just with us, but the composers are under pressure with the directors, with the studios, and with the budgets, and with the time crunches. And, and we come and, it's like showtime. We're going to record the music and we want to play the music, but there's 1,000 things going on that we don't even have an awareness of. And I will say this because it's funny in retrospect, but it wasn't funny at the time. But when I first started working, I was this kind of overachieving person who thought we were making great art, and I had more questions than there were time for. And composers would kind of pull me aside and say, if you don't need to ask that question, don't ask that question. We have a lot of stuff we're trying to get done here. And so when you're working with people, again, who have been pianists, and in John's case, a working pianist who was working for other people, you get this. He understands what you're thinking about, because he was there at one point doing it, and so that it just makes it more conscious, more real. I think
it's inconceivable that you could write music without any training, or it was then. Now it's not inconceivable, obviously, because of where we are. But anybody in the 50s or 60s that writes any music was trained, which means they knew, from one point of view or another, the orchestra. And it's completely changed now, but that's not the way that it was then. I remember Ralph, he gave that thing to Ralph at ET, because I played violin on ET. And from the day one, he gave it to him, and every break, Ralph, it's like the harp etude, the Chopin harp etude. It was that kind of, and every break, he's like obsessively practicing it. And then John recorded that at the last thing.
Composers, conductors, whatever, who came from that time, 40s, 50s into the 60s, every one of them had solid musical credentials as performers in some way. And that gives you a chance to get the respect of the musicians who you're going to be leading. That became very important. As things went on, as more jazz started to creep into the films and more of the pop industry as we moved forward, you did start to see more composers who would just sit at the keyboard, write it all out without really having that. And maybe because of the way films are scored now, every click track, streamers, all this stuff, there's a distance between the person who's written the music and the people playing it. Back then, there wasn't a distance at all. And I think that the composers, the musicians who played in the orchestras really appreciated it when the composers would ask them a question, because it meant it was one of the few things that composer didn't know, and they need our help here.
And in this sense, I would like to bring in Leanna, because she's a contemporary film composer, also concert music composer. So how much, in your opinion, Leanna, do you see John and Jerry as inspirational figures? I mean, I know that they are like, the utmost examples of great film composers, but what are the main things that you think a young composer can draft from their experience and their artistry?
Well, David and Leonard and Mike said it best, because I'm surrounded by other composers who they don't know how many symphonies Brahms wrote. They don't understand the way Ravel orchestrated. Like, they don't care. They hardly read music. When I just had a little session at Fox, and it was kind of this aleatoric thing, and the musicians were shocked that I could actually notate it. And I think it's like, what shows up on the stand every day that you don't understand how to create something? How many people do you have to rely on? And I think for me and my kind of quote unquote old fashioned training and conducting and, working with Leonard, just coming from a different classical world, when the way you listen to Jerry's music and John's music, not just away from the picture, with the score, figuring out how they did this, what does the sound do, these instruments in this register, when does this come in, thinning out the texture, building it up. But then when you see that craft against the film and how it doesn't take away from it, that it adds to it, and it wouldn't be, the film would be lesser if the music wasn't there. So I think that's such a profound thing for me when I listen to someone, for example, like Alien, right? That opening scene, because of kind of how I came of age, I expect to hear like these big toms and 12 horns and just that stupid wall of sound that we get all the time, that personally I'm a little sick of, but you don't get that. It's this light, it's like listening to lace, the way that he paints that picture of the opening, the space and that ship, and you just don't expect to hear that, and just how it creates that story that is now iconic. But nobody, because of that score and the juxtaposition of what we were seeing on the screen, nobody knew what to expect, and everything was always so, at every turn it was just something different. And I think that music was just another character for that. So for me, that's what I take away, just the way that I listen. And I think because that's just the way I was trained.
I wonder if we can talk briefly, maybe some here who are familiar with both men personally can speak about any sort of personal relationship they might have had.
David, you certainly knew them both personally and probably saw them socially as well as just on a scoring stage.
I really didn't. My sense of composers, especially film composers, is there isn't as much camaraderie as you would think. There isn't as much, I guess in a studio system, yeah, they're all there together and they are listening to each other's things. But I always got the sense that John and Jerry were pretty competitive with each other. I don't know this intrinsically. Like I never saw them together.
But I think that's a good point. There is a kind of competitiveness that comes into this. I don't remember seeing them. I remember seeing them separately, of course, whether they were in Fox or wherever they happened to be. What I do remember, though, is I saw them a lot at Capitol Records where my parents were recording all the time, whether they were a quartet or with Sinatra or with Nat King Cole, whatever. They used to come into those sessions quite often. I'm not sure they ever came together, but I really believe, I know that both of them were keenly interested in the quartet because they both had a passion for the classical literature. No, Jerry came into a Beethoven quartet session. I remember that very clearly. And he had the score of Opus 132, and my parents were recording it. So they kept that passion, that interest for the area where they came up in. But I think Dave is right. It's competitive. Maybe they were friends, maybe not. But certainly there was a great deal of respect. You didn't have to love somebody, but you had to respect them.
Jerry used to have regularly at New Year's Eve, which I know that David attended a couple of times, where he did 8-hand piano. And I understood from Jerry that John was part of some of those nights. So they would play together as, 4 people.
John Williams is almost like a concert pianist. And Jerry can play, but doesn't. John is a completely different has a completely different ability. John is incredible at the piano. I was at Tanglewood a few years ago when Audra McDonald was there, and he just sat down and played. As time goes by, just improv. It was amazing. It was like nothing for him.
Why does he then say he's just okay?
They all pretend to be. It's like Jerry never talks. Jerry hardly ever talked that much about. When you would interview Jerry, wasn't it? It was kind of difficult to interview Jerry, wasn't it?
It all depended on who he was talking to.
I did an interview with him. I did 2 shows for the BBC, one about Korngold and one about Rocha. And I had the chance to get Jerry over at Pink's hot dog stand. We went there and we shot a little bit of an interview. And you're right, it was hard to get him to focus on talking about another composer. He didn't really seem comfortable doing it. I mean, it worked out okay, but no.
He doesn't like to talk about himself either.
No.
Like my father's era, my father just would poo-poo all the Academy Award nominations and Academy Awards, and they were just in some place in our house. No one gave a crap. I think that also you got to remember the history, the horrible things that Stravinsky said and Britten said and wrote about film music. I mean, it's just, and they don't even know what they're talking about. They don't even they haven't even listened to it except maybe a few bars of it. It's just intrinsically horrible. And I think they all had to deal with this. And then they're getting paid so much money and it's jealousy and competitive and blah, blah, blah. So I think part of that, John doesn't really explain all that much about his process either, really. I mean, there are some things that he does, but I don't know. Maybe composers aren't talking about.
I think part of it is the people who do it really well have an innate talent to do it, and you can't put it into words. So I'm sure, David, somebody asked you, well, how do you do that? How are you doing this? You would have to really stop and think about it, and it might wind up inhibiting. I find that all the time. If somebody asks me how I do something, I actually don't want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it, even though I do teaching, because the more I get into what I do, I feel it might actually put a constraint on me that I don't want.
It's funny. Bernard Herrmann hasn't come up, and Jerry told me that Bernard Herrmann was very much an influence from moving from actually doing his own orchestration on full score down to an 8-staff sketch. And he did the same thing with John Williams, and at least that's what Jerry told me, that it made all the difference in the world. I know, especially when we would be on the stage doing a score recording, I would have that. And same, with what David had done.
You'd have the sketch, Bruce, or the full, what are you saying?
Yeah, I have a lot of Jerry's sketches from a lot of the movies we did.
8-line sketches that are all detailed, like in tiny little handwriting, who plays
right.
what. And that's what he would use to conduct, right? They wouldn't use full scores to conduct. I think John used full scores.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, but Jerry always used the 8-line.
Which is what they did at Fox. They would use sketches, and then the orchestrator would be there with the
extrapolate, right?
When you think of John Williams' concert repertoire, he would always program Jerry Goldsmith in his concerts, and often the many Boston Pops albums he recorded, he would often program Jerry Goldsmith. So I think, it's a good point to make. There was definitely that respect there.
Well, I was thinking about where the two of them were similar to me, and I just really remember the first. When I commissioned Jerry to write the music for orchestra, which I think is 1970, is that right? And then I did the premiere of John's Violin Concerto. What struck me about it is how both Jerry and John, they were really frightened that the pieces weren't going to be good, that the orchestrations weren't going to work. I mean, all of a sudden they turned into these insecure composers, and they were well established. That actually was surprising. This idea that they felt in control when they were doing their films and television, but completely out to sea. And we had to do all we can. So, this is really good. You don't have to worry about this. And that's something I think a lot of composers for film and television share. They get a little bit reticent when they have to go back to the way they started off when they were students.
Do you think that that's coming from the general snobbery from, you know, some of the classical world towards film music that they were?
At the time, that's a very good point, because we're, 1970 and in that area, we're still at the point where, very few of us were taking this music seriously.
And remember, Leonard, like 1980, when John started doing the Boston Pops, I think, wasn't it like 83 or 84? He just walked off.
Oh, yeah.
Even John, somebody as even-tempered as John, just had enough because they and that was in the 80s. And I really think, I've said this before, I think John Williams is almost, that thing with the Boston Pops is almost singularly responsible for all the film with live orchestra now, which to my opinion is, if you are going to do film music, you should present it in its original intended form and then judge it based on, so that all the players, first of all, can hear what it is and then make their own decision as to what they think of the music, and then it just ripples out from.
And isn't this ironic now? This music that was considered by so many people in the orchestral world as being, we'll do it. Now, orchestras are surviving because of it.
There's a scene in E.T. when the mother is reading Peter Pan to Gertie, to the Drew Barrymore character, and it's this elaborate harp solo. Which Dorothy Renson played, as I recall.
Dorothy Renson.
And Annie Stockton was there too, but this was one harp. And I remember John was always like, it was all this weird pedaling stuff, and they were talking all the time. But anyway, so you have this theme at the beginning that goes dun da 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 da. It's the adult. It's a menace. It's kind of a menace theme, though you don't really know what the adults are, because they're hidden all the time. And so he's playing this music, right? This harp thing. And the camera just starts to pan out, and it pans into these adults surveilling, listening to the conversation. And you don't really know if they're menacing or not. And he has a flute. As the harp little melody is going, just plays that, dum ba dum bum bum bum. And it's just brilliant. And you'll never hear that unless you watch the film. And the other thing about E.T., which I've conducted several times, when you do this, you get a video where you can mute the music. So if you mute the beginning of E.T. and the camera pans down from the star field and it's in, and you hear a coyote, it seems like menacing and weird. When you listen, now I know, we know what it is, but when you put the music in, it completely changes it. It becomes religious. It becomes, they're like benevolent scientists trying not to disturb this beautiful, bucolic, pastoral world.
He used the words religioso in the written.
But that's the problem studying film music, is it's hard to take it away, aside from how freaking hard it is to get a hold of it, because it's a studio that owns it and not a publishing company. It's that you can't take away the music and then put it back and see what it does. But I think the orchestra's playing it, rehearsing it, several performances, hearing it over and over and over again. You can now start to make a reasonable decision is this good or not good?
Bruce, I'd love to ask you about the Poltergeist sessions, that strange experience of having John coming to the session of Poltergeist and attending and listening to the music. So what do you remember about that incredible score? I mean,
one afternoon, John showed up and was hanging out. And it was actually the prelude to E.T., because Stephen had moved to MGM. He had an office there, he and Frank. And for some reason, Stephen didn't want to record at Fox. So he asked John to come to MGM, and it was still MGM at that time, to sit in. And I guess he liked enough what he heard to bring E.T. there.
And do you remember any exchanges between Jerry and John on the stage, or they were just looking around the things with Stephen? So how was the the atmosphere, the environment? How was that?
It was very, very warm. I believe that John pulled up a chair near me. I think Arthur Morton at that time was doing the orchestration. So there was Arthur and then there was John and then myself and the second engineer. But, the relationship was very warm.
Well, was Poltergeist wasn't the LA Phil, was it?
Yes.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
But with some added, it said like Jim Thatcher played on it.
Jim Walker was principal flute, I think.
A lot of the principals were the studio guys.
Oh,
And it was very interesting because one of the things that Jerry said, and this is no reflection on the Hollywood musicians, but he said that he was astonished by the LA Phil's ability to play dynamics together quickly.
Well, I mean, the what we think of as the climactic cue in Poltergeist when they go into the light in the closet and rescue the little girl is a 7-minute cue, and what you hear in the movie is one take.
One of the keys is that a composer can amplify what the director and everybody's put together and make it an even greater experience. But a really great composer takes a film that maybe was second rate, could have gone in the toilet, and makes it incredible. So for me, the John score I point to is The Fury. That, if you took the music out of that, is horrible, but just that odd ride that the Arab population is on. I mean, what brilliant scoring. And for Jerry, my favorite one of those kind of films, Magic. The harmonica and strings, to use the harmonica to represent the dummy. I mean, this is just, that's where you get that genius.
I always said Jerry consistently always wrote the score for the movie the filmmakers wished they had made.
Yeah.
also the beginning of Chinatown, and in 5 seconds with the strumming of the piano down and the harps in unison that make the dappled water as the water goes down. In like 5 seconds, you have a weird noirish sense of what that movie's about, And I think he tells that story right. Robert Evans asked him, well, what orchestra do you, he has 9 days to do, what orchestra do you want? And Jerry told me the story. He said he had no idea what to say. So he just said something. He said 4 harps, 4 piano strings, percussion, and he said he didn't think about it at all. He just said it. But somewhere it's perfect.
Something I always have used in the past when someone who is unfamiliar with what film music actually does. An example I always use is from the same year as Magic, which is a year that Jerry did 6 scores, is Coma, which is a movie where there's no score for 55 minutes. And then there's this scene, the cue is called Jefferson Institute, where the 2 main characters are driving up to this very bizarre brutalist building that's a medical facility. But the music entirely defines how you're supposed to feel and the impression you're supposed to have from the film. The building was, at that time, the Northeast headquarters of the Xerox Corporation. Now it's the Kinney Shoe headquarters. So there's nothing inherently menacing about the building. When you look at it without music, you feel nothing. If you were to put happy music, you would probably feel joyful. But it's because of what he did with the score, it totally tells the story and dictates exactly what the inner soul of the picture is all about. And that's really the purpose that the music serves. But I always loved that particular one for waiting 55 minutes to bring score in at all. And then the second hour is just this gangbusters Goldsmith score.
Maybe one of you can answer this for me. John told me one time that he has no problem writing for almost anything, but the one thing he wouldn't do and said he couldn't is to write music for cartoons. And I guess the opening of Catch Me If You Can is the closest he came. And I have no idea if Jerry ever wrote for cartoons.
He did a documentary called General with the Cockeyed Id that has some animation in it. It's a mix of live action, but there are some animated sequences. And he wound up doing, the Twilight Zone movie is like a takeoff of Warner Brothers cartoons, like a nightmarish version of that. And he he studied, Carl Stalling, and did a lot of Carl Stalling like effects in that. And then he has Looney Tunes as his last movie.
His Joe Dante collaboration started with Twilight Zone the movie and ended with Looney Tunes Back in Action.
There's a cartoon in Jurassic Park.
That's right.
Yes.
With Mr. DNA, which is named Stalling Around. And actually, he also had to fill in extra Looney Tunes music in Close Encounters of the Third Kind for the Rogers cartoon that's on the TV. And that he called Lava Flow. So if you know the names of the Looney Tunes composers, and he also had to, prior to that, do sort of similar thing for a Roadrunner cartoon in the Sugarland Express, his first movie with Steven Spielberg. So there's these little bits of source music that show that they could sort of adapt the style that was used in cartoons, but maybe the closest John Williams has come would probably be something like Adventures of Tintin.
I think Jerry also did one of his last big ones was Mulan for Disney.
Right.
That shouldn't be construed as a cartoon. It's an animated feature.
And Secret of Nim, Jerry also did, but he scored that and Mulan very much as not cartoons, I would argue. I think Looney Tunes, which was half animated, half live action, is the best example of him writing cartoony music. He somehow made it all his own style, but it is very much Stalling inspired in terms of the way he'd incorporate concert pieces and popular tunes and that sort of thing.
I'd love to ask to Mike Lang about a couple of solos you did with both Jerry and John. The first one is the Russia House, in which you have a duet with Branford Marsalis, and the other ones for John, which you were also credited on the soundtrack album, is in Hook. You played that beautiful quasi-jazz-like piece called Banning Back Home.
The thing that was really interesting about the Russia House for me was that Jerry called me and asked me to come to his studio when he was preparing a demo for the director, and I'd never done that. Actually, the only time I think that I was at Jerry's house was earlier on. We were talking about these multi-piano evenings, and I remember being there with David Newman one night. There were, I think, 4 or 5 of us, and we were like relay teams, and we're playing like operatic transcriptions, with 1,000 notes and 1,000 sharps, and Jerry was one of the pianists, so we got to have that. But anyway, I went to his house, and the reason he wanted me there, as you probably are aware, Jerry was always at the forefront of technology. He owned and knew how to do all kinds of things with the synthesizers. He was always pushing the envelope, looking for new timbres, and he was hands-on, And so when we played synthesizers on his sessions, unlike anybody else that we would work for, we were given cartridges and specific sounds to play. And actually, I'll digress for a minute, because once I was on a session with him and I said, hey, Jerry, I said, when we work for other guys, we come in and it'll just say like a low drone that's kind of menacing. We just orchestrate the synthesizer. What would it be like if we took your sound and then look at it as a point of departure and see if something else would come up? And he gave me this really intense look and he said, do I tell the oboe player what colors to produce? He said, I write for the oboe the same way I write for a synth. I know what I want. I know the colors. He says, I don't understand the other guys. So that was that conversation. So then the question is, why would he want me there? Well, he wanted me there because what he wanted to create was the sound of, he had engaged Branford Marsalis to play soprano saxophone. And at the time, which changed, it was going to be like the sound of a DX7 electric piano. And he wanted the sound of an electric bass, like a fretless bass that John Patitucci was going to play. So he needed me there to give performance character to the demos and to come up with the sounds. And he was, the thing that was so funny that transpired was he says, all right, I've heard that you have a really cool synth DX7 electric piano sound. He said, can you give that to me? And I said, well, I can with my own ear, but I don't have that. And so I said, here's what I do. I have 2 monophonic DX7s and I pan them at 45 degrees and I take 2 sounds that kind of interact with each other and I chorus it and add some echo. And I said, so if you have a couple of DX7s or, you have a library of since electric piano sounds. Let's see what we do. So he gives me the thing. I go and I do it, and I feel like I'm on a descending elevator, and I look at him when it's done, and I said, well, how's that? And he says, I hate you. And I said, you hate me? Okay, that's all right, but how's the sound? But we had that kind of relationship. If he liked you, he would talk to you that way. And he said, that's why I hate you. And I said, you hate me because of the sound. The sound's no good. He says, no, the sound is great. That's why I hate you. And I said, okay, can I ask why you hate me if the sound is good? He says, yeah. He says, I didn't create the sound. I'm a control freak. He said, so I said, well, look, you can have credit for the sound. I don't need to have that, But anyway, we went on, we got the whole thing done, and he was happy, and it was good for the director, I guess. And so when we got to the stage, the electric piano thing that he hated, loved, was gone, and it was acoustic piano, and the bass had become acoustic bass. And so the way this thing started was we rehearsed the main title, and I'm going to tell this additional story because it's just so much about the fun kind of eccentricity that's so wonderful about working with Jerry. So he always liked me to come in the booth and hang around in case he wanted to talk to me, which was sometimes great, and sometimes I wish I wasn't there. But anyway, I'm pulled into the booth, and so they play the thing back, and it's basically the main theme with Branford playing the melody. And he comes up to me, he says, Mike, I don't like the way Branford's playing. And I didn't understand what he was talking about. Branford was playing it beautifully. He was just playing the melody, playing it literally. It was beautiful. I said, it sounds okay to me. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, when you played that synth version, you put all this like pitch bend and you did things, you gave it character. And I said, well, he's probably just being respectful of your music. Just tell him to loosen it up. I'm sure it'll be great. It'll be much better than what I did. And he looks at me, he says, you tell him. I'm like, well, I'm just the keyboard player in the band. I can't tell him. I said, I just met him. And so Jerry says, I just met him too. I said, yeah, but you hired him.
Mike, I don't know if you remember, but Branford came in with his soprano sax, and it wasn't his sax. The day before he had put it in the shop to be repadded. So he was playing a strange instrument, and so he was a little timid with it.
Oh, okay, that's good to know. So, but anyway, it gets better / worse, because when we walk out of the MGM or Sony thing, all of a sudden he's got his arm around me, which was not something that happened very often. And while he's walking out, and we're in front of the orchestra, he yells at Branford, "Hey, Branford, Mike's got something to tell you." He puts it on me. All right, so that's the fun story, and then it was wonderful. Branford loosened it up, and blah 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 blah. But the thing that was so kind of interesting was when we played the end title of Russia House, and it was basically it ended with just the trio, and we're playing maybe looser than we played throughout the score, and it's really going, And I was so excited, so I was really into it, and we just kept playing, way beyond what the film was supposed to be. And evidently what happened was the director loved it so much, he reprised the visuals just to give it more time during the end credits and just have that music play. And Jerry had mentioned that to me somewhere along the way after that. So that was, it was a great moment. It was a great film, and to have that music be a part of it. And anyway, I'll go on to so John on Hook, they had temp tracked Mountain Dance by Dave Grusin, which was an instrumental. I don't think it was originally part of the movie at all, but it was a very successful record for Dave, and a cool song, very, kind of funky and in Dave's sort of fusiony style. And John called me up and he said, we're going to be doing this thing. And he said, I need your input about maybe musicians and stuff like that. And I said, well, the first thing that occurs to me is, why don't you call the musicians who were either on that record or regular people who are in LA that Dave works with? It would be those people. And he said, who would they be? And I said, well, here's who I'm thinking you should try, because they're all in LA and they're all freelance musicians. Try and get Lee Ritenour and maybe Mitch Holder for the guitars, get Abel Boreal, get Harvey Mason, if you can get Paulino da Costa, because that was the instrumentation. And I think it'll be perfect. It'll sound like the style of that music. So it worked out. I think everybody was pretty much available. And so we're at Fox and we're recording it. And there's a big piano jazz solo, Alec Grusin, in the middle of it. And I just had this idea that would be fun because it felt really good. And it felt, the way it was feeling in the studio was a little more muscular and a little funkier than Dave's record. It felt a little more R&B, a little gospel-y. So when I took the piano solo, I kind of pushed it a little that way, and I was referencing Richard Cheese playing in my mind, and it wasn't that drastic what I did. It was just whatever. And John was in the booth because he didn't need to conduct or anything. And so we did the first take, and I heard, "Michael, that's totally wrong." And I'm like gulping, right? And I said, "Well, what's the matter?" He said, "It needs to be more like Mozart, like Poulenc." I said, "Okay." So we pulled it back a little bit.
I wanted to do a little slide step. Dave, were you on Twilight Zone? Were you playing in the orchestra?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really unique about that film is that we did the synths playing live in the room through guitar amplifiers. And a lot of that's, I don't want to say it all it was, Jerry's imagination so he could balance the orchestra. And one of the things I loved about both Jerry and John is that starting the session, they would run through a cue, usually a big one, without headphones, so that they could balance the room, which always made it much easier for me to get a good sound. So I'm just curious about Twilight Zone, playing in the room. Mike, you were on that with James Newton Howard and Ralph.
Yeah, Jerry, one of the episodes, he kind of used Les Noces of Stravinsky as a template for the sound, and he had four pianists, and it was very much that kind of piano writing. And the keyboard section was myself and Ralph and James Newton Howard and Ian Fraser.
Wow.
May I ask Mike and anyone who played with the two a more of a broad question? Not so much when you're the featured solo instrument, but just as a part of the overall musical moment. Are there differences in the way you might broadly characterize how John Williams would use a piano as part of a greater whole, and how Jerry would use piano as part of a greater whole? Did you have a sense going in of, okay, when I'm not featured, I'm going to be doing things like this because it's a Goldsmith score, or things more like that with Williams?
Well, the main difference is because we're now not just talking about piano, we're talking about multiple keyboard players and keyboard instruments. And as I mentioned before, Jerry's synthesizer stuff was all specific. And with John, it was exactly the opposite. He would just write the music and the descriptions, and we would design the sounds, and he would, say, he would give us little notes about how to bring it into the final form. And so that was a big difference. They both wrote so well for keyboard instruments. It's hard to say. It's more about their vocabulary, I think, than about the pianistic part of it. With Jerry, I found on more projects, I had the opportunity for freedom to do things once in a while stylistically. That didn't happen as much with John.
I remember, Mike, like Jerry Goldsmith, you'd read down, it just didn't sound like instantly great, but John's stuff always sounded great from the get-go. So I saw it's like the difference of rehearsing, say, well, Leonard, you know this better than me, but like rehearsing La Mer or rehearsing Rite of,
Sure.
Stravinsky always it just sounds good. It's hard to play, but like something like La Mer it takes a lot of work to sound good. And Jerry, none of them were that great of conductors. They all got better, but as they went along, I don't know, the time I played from 76 to about 82, I probably played on 15 or 20 of Jerry's and John's, and they weren't that good of conductors. So there was that problem as well, I thought.
I could jump in on that because I played for both of them a lot, and I totally agree with David. John got so much better. I mean, John became a real conductor, and Jerry always was very humble about his conducting stuff. And in fact, it brings up another funny story. Was Jerry, again, being such a tech head, he loved variable clicks. You know, when Oracle came out, that was like heroin for him. You know, and it's like, there was this beautiful romantic Jerry Goldsmith wonderful moment, and I had to coordinate playing something really romantic with playing a quarter note triplet figure with the timpani with Larry Bunker, and it felt horrible with this click. And so we were on a 10, and I went to the podium and I said, Jerry, is there any possibility that you would consider just conducting this without, you know, just do it to the screamers or whatever? It's so romantic. And when you rehearse the orchestra, you don't use the click, and it's fantastic. And then it just becomes, it becomes really difficult to keep that magic going. He says, Mike, he says, look, I'm thinking about the director. I'm thinking about the movie. I'm not a great conductor. This allows me not to have to think about it. And that's it. And I said, and that's I said, there's no wiggle room. That's it, right? He said, yeah, that's it. And I said, okay. And I walked away and I got an idea, and I went back and I said, can I ask you one more thing? And typical of him, he said, well, you just did. And I said, okay, well, now, what about if you wear the click and we don't wear the click? What would that be like? And he paused for 20 seconds and he thought for 20 seconds and he said, no. And I said, we're done, right? He said, we're done.
If you want to get a good idea of John's piano skills, didn't he do an album with Jesse Norman where he plays piano?
Yes, he did. Yes.
And it's fantastic. I remember one of my exes was a soprano, and she was taken by this album, and we actually had somebody transcribe note for note John's take on Love Is Here to Stay. But it's a really good way to get to hear him very much as almost a solo pianist.
He made some jazz records early on, trio records, and then he made some records where Andre Previn arranged for him under Johnny Williams, and he's an amazing pianist, amazing harmonically, especially. He has his own voice and his way of doing things, and for me, he plays a song like he understands the lyric. He plays it as a song. He understands the narrative power of the music, even though it's just piano. It's not stupid piano music for pianists, and he's a great accompanist also. I mean, very often with the Boston Pops, he would play and accompany the singers, and fantastic.
There was one other example I can give. In Washington, we had a 2-week festival of film, and John co-curated it with me. He came and did 1 week of performing with me. And one thing we did at the beginning of one of the sessions was he had a montage of silent film clips put up, and then he wrote something for us to play 4 hands. So when we came out to start the show, there was an upright piano. There was a little lamp over on the top of the piano, and we both had green visors to wear. And I don't know if that music still exists or if he ever did it again, but it was very clever and it was a lot of fun to do.
I would love to see the Jerry Goldsmith piano part that John played, that you sent that score to. I would love to see that part. Because when you really listen to it, even though it's just a bunch of stuff, you listen to it, there are melodic kernels and little things going on there that are really, really special.
Would you say that to you, it sounds like Jerry wrote that part with John in mind, like his abilities? Or do you think John was just capable? Yeah.
No, he didn't, because he had someone else in mind originally. I mean, the one thing I did hear about that session was, Jerry said that he was working with his agent. It was probably Bobby Helfer, who was also a contractor, and that Bobby had said he had someone in mind to play that part that Jerry didn't know, and Jerry did not want to deal with anybody new because he knew that how complex the piano part was. And Helfer said, just trust me on this. And then Jerry was amazed by how well Williams played it. And he said that Jerry had to do some jazz writing back then, like crime jazz, which I thought was great, but he said that he really wasn't good at it and didn't have a great understanding of jazz. But Williams had come out of jazz performance, and he said that Williams at that time knew much more about jazz than he did, and he basically said, we lost a great a great session pianist because Williams wound up composing.
I heard a story that I'd like somebody to corroborate or tell me it's not exactly true. But I heard, also I wanted to mention, I did a little bit of research, and I was trying to figure out the name of the guy that John studied with prior to going to Juilliard and working with Rosina Levine, and it was Robert Van Epps, who worked in MGM in the music department. He was an amazing pianist, and I'm guessing, but I think I'm right, that John did more than classical music with Bobby Van Epps, because he was a versatile pianist. But the thing I heard of during the time that John was with Rosina Levine, there was a conversation at some point where Rosina Levine said, "You're a really good pianist, and you can spend 8 hours a day the rest of your life, and you probably will have some kind of career." But she said, "You probably will do better by writing." And I think she kind of put that in his head to some extent. Anybody know anything about that?
I do. That's, as far as I know, it's true, because the other Levine students that were around at the same time, I was also a Juilliard student, they confirmed that happened, that she said that. And she said it to others as well. And she pointed out shortly before she died how she was the one who started his career.
Can somebody talk about how John got the Boston Pops? And David, you alluded to the fact that he was furious and he stomped off, but I don't know the story, and maybe some of the listeners would like to know that, and also know about how he got to the Pops. I know that Ernest Fleischman had a lot to do with it. Is that correct?
Fiedler got ill for some Hollywood Bowl shows, I think in the late 70s, and John took over for that, and that might have been some kind of preamble to discussions with him on a short list of who might succeed Fiedler when he stepped down.
Plus, that's 3 years after start. I mean, he's like the biggest deal in music almost. I mean, you could make a case that more people had heard his music and knew him than anyone. But do any of you know the exact story how he got there? I know Mark Newman was still his agent, right, at the time?
I know.
I think Mark brokered the deal. Yeah.
I know how that happened, and I've actually never told this publicly. So Fiedler dies, and Fiedler was a hard act to follow. There was a very distinct format for the Boston Pops. The concerts were in 3 parts. The first part was what we loosely called light classical. I don't even know that exists anymore. The second part was a concerto, with usually the young pianist or violinist. And then the third part were the lighter works, film music, something like that. Well, I was directing the Pittsburgh Symphony at something called Great Woods, which was outside of Boston. And Tom Morris, who was the manager, executive director of the Boston Symphony, which were still running the Pops at that time, came to see me. And he asked me if I was interested in taking it over. Now, this was at a point where I could have done it, but my career was moving in a different direction, and I just didn't think it was something that I felt comfortable doing at this point. Maybe a little earlier, yes. Maybe even a little later, yes. And then he asked, did I have anybody that I would recommend for this? And I don't think it was because of me, but I certainly did say, go with the trend now. John Williams is a person, he conducts well, he has a lot of variety. And the main thing for the Pops, they needed somebody who could have access to arrangements. That's the heart of the Pops. Unless you could really get arrangers or have arrangements yourself. That's why they had Richard Heyman during the Fiedler years, and they needed somebody who could bridge that kind of gap. So I don't know exactly what happened after my meetings, but it was not so long after that John was appointed to the job.
And I think John also brought great arrangers from Hollywood. I mean, he got Sandy Courage to do arrangement for the Pops, and also Angela Morley, also people who were doing some orchestration work for him. He brought them to Boston as well.
There's a last part of that, because if you go back and look at the Fiedler years, he had Heyman and a few others, but the problem was that times were changing, and the artists in the pop industry were not being kept up in the way the Boston Pops needed them. So this was the vital part, getting somebody who had access to arrangers, more so than the conducting part.
What do you think, Leonard, though, if at that particular time where he had done Jaws, Star Wars, Close Encounters, Superman, made him say, hey, I'm looking for, directorship of an orchestra at that point in time, because he didn't really need to, but yet he took it?
Well, think about it. Those of you who are in this profession, it's in one way a great honor and privilege, because you have these wonderful worlds of cinema to deal with and your name gets up there. But I think for people who have gotten used in their early life to being performing musicians in front of a public, that there was something that was attractive to John about that, even as shy and reticent as he could be. I think he needed that outlet, something to get him away when he could from just writing and putting it on the screen. That would be my guess.
It couldn't be better timing. And Leonard, do you remember that? Were you aware that he walked out on them and got on a plane and went home? Do you know that?
It was a big story. So
yeah.
What happened?
I forgot the year, but after a few years,
84, I think 84 it was.
84. Yeah. So he'd been there doing this for a while, and the musicians many of them just didn't respect someone who came from that world. Fiedler, remember, was a violinist in the Boston Symphony, and he came out and formed his pops group, and that was all a big deal. Now it was an outsider was coming to them, somebody not from Boston, as it were. And they were just rude. They interrupted rehearsals. They made life difficult for John, and he was fed up. And I know that he said, as he got angry, how much work he was bringing to them, and that they had to start to consider these things. So it was all about how the orchestra was treating him. He didn't expect to be treated any differently than any other conductor that stood in front of the Boston Symphony.
But Leonard, he did get on a plane and leave,
yeah,
as I recall. And Mark, his agent, they begged him to come back. So once he got back, then he now has the authority. They're not going to do that again, I assume, is what happened. It must have been a big deal in the.
It was huge
too. Yeah.
There was a lot of news about it. It was in the summer of '84, and he had just come out and done the Olympics thing with the LA Phil. And there was just sort of publicly, they just said creative and artistic differences, but it was sort of all sorted out within a matter of 6 weeks or so. And then he was back and announced that he would continue.
I can say that BBC cameras were actually there and caught some of the footage of him scolding the orchestra. But it's quite interesting. I mean, the orchestra whistling, he's playing, I think, America the Beautiful, and then he says, "Do I have to justify the need?" Basically, stop whistling.
I found a New York Times article. So John actually resigned, not only to get on the plane and leave, he resigned. And then they somehow worked it out quickly. It says here in this article, it had been widely reported that Mr. Williams had failed to establish a rapport with the Boston Pops, and that musicians had been disrespectful, reading, talking, and joking during rehearsals. That's all true. Then they said, yesterday, neither the orchestra nor Mr. Williams had anything negative to say about each other. Quote, "In spite of what people may imagine, I have great affection for the Boston Pops. I'm returning because our differences have been settled amicably. In addition, I want to participate in the centennial season and help implement some much needed changes." It looks like, for the little rest of this, the chairman of the players said, "Anytime you have 100 people working together, some will be dissatisfied." Musicians built up a certain repartee with Mr. Fiedler, who was a feisty, assertive character. Mr. Williams is much gentler and more gracious, even low-key, and he may still be finding his way with the orchestra. That wasn't a good thing to say.
While we're living in this concert hall world, I wanted to throw a question to Leanna, because you have had the great fortune of sharing something in common with both Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams, in that you have had Leonard conduct one of your works, at least one, for the concert hall. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about what that experience was like, and maybe the two of you can discuss your process of bringing about that performance of your work.
Oh my goodness, I don't even know if Leonard remembers it. It was
Nashville, how could I forget?
Oh, it's so kind. Poor Leonard. I was part of the American Conductors something or other. There were
Institute.
4 of us, and I just remember I literally had a score in my hand, and I would follow him all around the bowels of the Kennedy Center. Maestro, have you seen my piece? Maestro, have you seen my piece? I think you should see it. I think you should see it. And he just said, fine, I'll conduct it. I'll premiere it. Just get away from me. So in Nashville, we did it, and or he conducted it. And I just remember, I mean, they went through it once, and he turned around and he said, how was it? And I just felt like, okay, you can go home. It was great. He knew everything about it. He knew what to do. You know, I don't know. It's an amazing experience. I don't personally like to perform anymore. I don't conduct that much. And when I do, I much prefer to be in the pit. I love ballet. I love opera. And that's where I lived before I stopped. But I will say it was just so comforting to have somebody else do it, to be done and to hand somebody a score and it's just finished. That's wonderful to me.
This project Leanna is talking about we went for 9 years in Washington, and we would have 4 conductors for a 3-week period. The idea was to get conductors who had really never stood in front of a professional orchestra before. It's very different than working in a college level, amateur, youth orchestra. All of a sudden, you're in front of people who've mostly played music more often than you've conducted it. So for the most part, these are people who are trying to enter into the professional circuit of conducting. But Leanna was more interested, I think, in promoting her creative side as well. And we weren't there for that in Washington. But finally, I did take a look at it. And I thought, you know, this is actually good. And I want to do a program in Nashville where I think I had 3 premieres on the first half. Was that right?
Mm-hmm.
What I do with composers is I make sure that they're happy with what it is. And then we collaborate in terms of what I think or the musicians think needs to be changed. There's always something. And when you get into the concert world, if it could be the hall, it could be the orchestra, it could be anything. There's no composition ever that can be played exactly like it's written because the circumstance and venues and environments change. Dynamics can change. Notes can even change depending on what you hear. So I just want to make sure that everybody who is writing a piece feels that they've been able to have what they wanted expressed. And I just kind of, you know, put the little dressing on and change a little bit. And often I don't tell the composers I've changed something. Most of the time they don't notice it.
I was happy to have it. It was beautifully played.
Leonard, do you think it's more difficult for a composer who's rooted and spends most of his or her time in the film world to go back to the concert hall and think differently? I mean, you worked with both Jerry and John in this regard. How much was different their attitude? I mean, you spoke briefly before by saying that Jerry was worried about that the piece wasn't enough, and probably John as well. But how different do you see them as musicians and composers?
It's very interesting when you go back to the old studio days and you see somebody like Alfred or Hugo Friedhofer, or the people who were the music directors at the studio. Often they were conducting and the composer was either in the booth or out there. Somebody else did it quite often. Someone like Korngold, however, was a very accomplished conductor, and he conducted himself. But I wonder if sometimes the composers want to conduct just so they don't have to be in the booth with the producer. But on the other hand, maybe I did a Corigliano score in London, and he needed to be in the booth because that's how it's going to sound. It's not going to be like it is out there with the live musicians. So I always think it's maybe helpful to have the composer listening in the booth, doing the balances, figuring all this stuff out.
Leanna mentioned Alien earlier on, and Jerry said he felt he had to be in the booth for that because of all the weird instruments and the particular kind of landscape of sound that he was going for. You couldn't hear it from the podium. You could only hear it if it was all mixed.
I remember in Star Trek, Bruce, Jerry would rehearse everything, and then wouldn't Lionel would come out and do the takes. So Jerry would rehearse it, and then he would go in the. Of course, it was a nightmare. So that's not a normal. It wasn't a normal situation.
It was pretty common. I mean, with Lionel conducting? He went to London with him and conducted numerous times.
I don't think Jerry always liked it either, having Lionel conduct. I think he sort of went hot and cold with Lionel. And, Lionel and John were like brothers. John worked at Fox. They both were early risers. Mainly, they would gather in the morning before they'd go to work, and they'd have coffee and donuts. And I think at the end of the day, they'd go home to their wives and kids. But John, that's where he went to work. So I think that whole thing with Jerry and John and Lionel was also sort of a thing. And Jerry did a lot of Fox films as well.
Something that's very interesting and maybe applies here, and maybe some of you could answer it. One year while I was music director here in St. Louis, I had Lionel come out and do a concert. And he got into trouble because he didn't know how to utilize an orchestral rehearsal session in terms of time. And he got behind.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think somebody said it earlier, but when you're in the film and the commercial industry, you have a different set of parameters for what you can do and record over a certain amount of time. Orchestra world, Pop's concert, maybe one rehearsal, 2.5 hours, sometimes 2. And Lionel ran out of time at the end.
My father, the little bit that he conducted, also got super nervous and he didn't have his guys. And like you said, it's a different
world.
And the whole idea of, if you write a piece of music and then you're going to conduct what you write, it's like as if you still have to study the piece as a conductor, and it's like you don't even know what you wrote. You have to study it all over again to do it. It is utterly, completely two different disciplines.
I'm very lucky in that I get to work with a lot of these sessions where I hear all of the chit chat and hear every take. And there are so many times where the first take on a Williams score, they'll come back to the second take and there'll be changes, because you'll hear him say, let's take this out of that bar and let's remove that line, we don't need it. So it's like it's on paper it's one thing, but not until you hear it. But he was not at all sort of bullish about what he'd written down. If he thought it should go, and Jerry was the same. You'd hear a lot of times where the first take, then he'd go in the booth and listen, and then when they come back and run the rest of the takes, there would have been changes just done on the spot there.
I got to tell this story. And it's not related. It's a Mancini story, but it fits in. Hank is doing a recording session. They do the first take. He comes back out, looks at the players, says, I think in the fifth measure, let's put 3 flutes on that instead of 2. And brass, let's go with the cup mutes over here in measure 25. And for the strings, could you change bow a little more often, all through the whole thing? He says, okay, I think we can have the second take, or should I just go myself?
I have a note that in a conversation where I think, Mike, you were hosting, Bruce, that in the interview, one of you mentioned that there was a point where Jerry specifically decided to be a real conductor, and it might have been somewhere around Gremlins or Explorers. Does that strike a memory with you? And what's behind that?
It was for a Star Trek movie. Might have been First Contact, I'm not sure. But Jerry used to go to the sessions, and he was conducting as if he was going to fly all the time. He was very big. So he got in contact with Sam Kwek-Molnich, which I guess he was the conductor for the opera in Rome. Am I correct?
Ballet.
The ballet. And Jerry took conducting lessons from him. And Sam would sit between the violas and the cello with Jerry's sketch in front of him, and sometimes a score, and stare at Jerry and, read through the score and then give him pointers in between takes. And Jerry became a real conductor through that time. That was a big deal. It changed the way that the performance that the orchestra gave. It became that much better, and probably, had it been at that point, Mike, where he would have said, "Yeah, don't wear the clicks." I
had a question for Leonard and maybe others in regards to the different relationship with concert music that Jerry and John had. they both kind of got into concert music or started exploring the possibility of writing concert pieces around the same time, the mid to late 60s. Jerry had actually his first piece, I'm pretty sure, ever on LP was a short toccata for solo guitar that he wrote for his friend Laurindo Almeida. And that was in 1958. But aside from that, they were both starting to write orchestral concert pieces around the same time. And Jerry only did it for a few years, like somewhere into the mid 70s. And then he basically stopped up until the very end of his life. He wrote a celebratory piece for LA called Fireworks. But John has consistently maintained a relationship with concert writing ever since he started. He hasn't kind of set it aside like Jerry did. And I wonder if you had any insight into that, whether Jerry just didn't find he had a taste for it. He didn't feel comfortable with it after a point. There was something I didn't ask you about in our interview, which if you know anything about it, would be fascinating. He had an aborted cello concerto called Quadrants that was announced in the trade papers. It was for a producer, I want to say, James William Guercio, I want to say.
James Guercio.
Guercio, okay.
James.
And this was announced and it had a title. It was called Quadrants and it never came about. And I was wondering if, maybe there was a bad experience that occurred on that made him swear off writing concert pieces for a while, unlike John, who maintained a regular output there.
The difference was that John was writing concert works almost all of his life. If you go back, you had the flute concerto, but you also had this string sinfonietta. You had another one for wind ensemble. He was constantly writing. So for him, it was a natural progression to want to write and continue that way. And once he became a conductor, he had clearly a forum to be able to do it. Jerry didn't have that. Jerry wrote the music for orchestra and the Christus Apollo and a couple other things. And the only way he could have maintained this is if there was a steady stream of commissions that would come through. So I don't think he soured on it, but I think just the opportunities didn't come up.
That's interesting you should say that, because there were a few times during score where I can think of Total Recall in particular. There's a scene with Schwarzenegger running through the tube station to get on the train, and it was a particularly good piece. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "There's a movement." And I said, "Okay, so where's the rest of the symphony?" He said, "I don't want to do that."
I mean, he wrote kind of a mini guitar concerto for Pat Metheny for Under Fire. And
that's true.
He kind of that was expanded for the album. It wasn't composed that way for the film. He wrote the opening piece of that album as a kind of standalone concert work almost. So he still kind of found little ways to dabble, I guess. But maybe that was because he wasn't getting commissions, offers from the concert hall world at that point.
It occurs to me that one thing, a project maybe that somebody could do, Korngold was remarkable in being able to take music that he'd written for film and transpose them into his concert works, in particular the violin concerto, which uses music from 5 different films. I wonder if somebody could go back into Jerry's archives, take some music, and concoct a piece where you don't say that this is music taken from films. That's the critical part. But really make a concert suite of some of Jerry's music. I know I've thought about it with Copeland in some cases, where some of his film scores have not been translated into particularly.
You volunteering?
No.
We hope you're the logical choice.
Well, I mean, you could never do it on stage, but he wrote Mephisto Waltz right around the time he did music for orchestra. And Mephisto Waltz is him taking elements of the Franz Liszt piece and doing this is incredible, imaginatory leaps with that material and just creating, just these stunning, mind-blowing effects with it. And, that's something concert composers do. They might do a riff on some famous work and development from that.
I think that one of the things that really brings John and Jerry together was their ability to write extremely interesting music, even for secondary scenes or for maybe not only the big sequences. And I think it was one of the musicians who I talked to recently that told me, the greatest music John wrote, and we can say the same for Jerry, is the music that no one notices usually. The transitional moments in, the passage from one sequence to the next. And I know that in Hollywood, there's a term for this that is called filigree, writing extremely sophisticated music even for, secondary scenes. And I think this is something quite unique. And I think they mastered that craft in my opinion, to the top that was ever produced in Hollywood.
I always found it very interesting, both with John, but especially with Jerry, where I saw them more than once say to the director, the music really doesn't work here. You don't need it. The string, the movie's strong enough to carry it without the music. That's pretty good.
I remember you made Poltergeist pop into my mind again. Before the big climactic cue that I mentioned earlier is a cue that precedes it. And there's a sequence where it's one unbroken 4-minute take of basically 5 people standing in a hallway talking. And when you listen to the music that Jerry writes, he's underscoring what's going on literally in another plane of existence. Where Carol Ann is. When you act, but you're not really consciously aware of it as you're watching the movie. But my God, when you listen to it on its own, what he did was just absolutely ingenious. And yes, the movie feels naked when you take the movie out. It absolutely needs it.
I wanted to actually talk about that sequence. That for me, there's 2 sequences where I was in a movie theater and could actually feel the entire audience reacting to music, and that was one of them, because that the whole plot of Poltergeist is that there is this unseen malevolent force that's manipulating everything that's going around. You never really get a view of what it is, but that whole sequence with Zelda Rubinstein kind of talking about what's going on, it's just dialogue. It's like Mike says, it's just people standing in a hallway, but I could feel the audience just being gripped by the throat by the music in that sequence, because he builds this motif for this beast, and it's moving around within the scene and just making its presence felt, and the audience is just cringing, and then he starts that little kind of staccato piano motif building up to them reaching for the doorknob. And, Zelda Rubinstein saying, okay, let's go get your daughter. The audience, by the time the fingers are going for that doorknob, the audience was ready to just absolutely explode, jump out of their seats. And it was not because of the dialogue, performances, anything going on that scene. It was the music building this incredible threat on the other side of the door. And the other time, I saw that was right around the same time was in the Twilight Zone movie, where John Lithgow's sitting in the seat next to the window, and he's sort of waking up, and you can see that he's tempted to open the shade to see if this gremlin is still out there. And Jerry starts this kind of fiddle, this Stravinsky kind of demonic fiddle scratching away, and I could see, I could see people silhouetted in front of me, by the light on the screen. I could see them all just starting to squirm and just twist around in their seats, because this music was just poking at them, just getting them ready for this scare. And I will never forget that, because it just showed the power that Jerry had to just be able to grab the audience by the throat and get them to focus on something and completely get across what the filmmaker was trying to do.
Jeff, in both of those scenes, exactly what the filmmaker is doing. That slow close in on the doorknob is something like 8 to 10 seconds. I mean, it would make you giggle at having your string pulled. And likewise, your whole thing is your Lithgow sequence is, he wants to open that, he wants to, and he knows he shouldn't. And it's just being sustained and sustained and sustained. And what Goldsmith does so well is make that not funny. He makes it work even when I sat in both times. The first time I saw that, and I was a kid, I was conscious. Suspense is being created. In my head, I'm like, he's yanking my chain, thinking of the director. And but my chain was still successfully being yanked. And to me, I have so much more respect for effects that work even when you can see the strings. And I think Goldsmith is the one that keeps that on that tightrope in those moments.
And speaking of this, I think it's a beautiful way to try to transition to the end of our conversation. I mean, let's try to close out with some thoughts from all of you guys about the legacy of both composers. So I would start maybe with Leonard. I mean, what remains of the craft of both Jerry and John as the primary film composers in Hollywood, and what could be the next logical step in the creation of a very popular orchestral music for modern audiences?
This is a very important question now. We have seen over the last 20 years or so, maybe a little more, a definite split in how composition for media have transpired. You have those who have a connection to the past. Jerry and John followed the traditions of the people that came before them. But you also have this other avenue, which seems more, let's just create something that works for what the visual is and not really think about going outside of that. We know what works, we're going to stick with it. So I think after a while, people are going to get a little bit tired of the generic, just as we're going to get tired of 85 superhero films in one season. People will be looking, and we found that during the pandemic. If you start looking at the numbers of what people are watching, what they're doing, they've branched out. People have gotten more interesting in terms of what their own choices are. I think the same is going to be said for composers. I think some people are going to return to some form of instrumental writing, which challenges people as listeners, as viewers for films. As far as Jerry and John are concerned, they don't have to worry. Their legacies are secured. They've participated in great films, been part of the great filmmaking process, and have created works that will last a long time. I'm one of these people that doesn't separate the different arts in terms of what their impact is. Motion picture, television, these are arts. They exist side by side with ballet, opera, whatever the other visual medias happen to be. So we recognize them to be great within the medium that they participate. If parts of it can be drawn out that appeal to another segment of the population, fine. But I think more people now have a broader sense of what art is. The question will be, who are the next ones? Who are the ones who are going to take all this tradition, move it forward, but still realizing what the connection to the past has been?
I wanted to follow up and ask about something you said during our conversation a couple of years ago. And you were kind of thinking about prospectively what you might put on a Jerry Goldsmith album if you were to record one yourself. You'd said for a long time you were interested to tackle Christus Apollo, and you're kind of thinking about maybe other things to pair it with, like if you can find the written music for 1,489 words, if Carol Goldsmith has it in a drawer or something like that.
You need a really good chorus, really good. And this has to be engineered to a fare thee well to make it work. It has to have a lot of space, but clarity at the same time. Whereas the radio program done with a really fine narrator who can bring a sense of gravitas to the story, crack group of musicians to play. You don't need a big orchestra for that. That's smallish. But to me, that's a great album. It would present Jerry in a way that so many people don't know.
But I feel like there's room for still, new surprises from both composers, whether it's concert pieces, new recordings of those. I gather that since he left the Star Wars universe, John has been concentrating on concert works this past year. But so there's going to be new pieces from him. There may be older pieces from Jerry to rediscover. Leanna, I just want to say next time I'm going to ask you about looking at Jerry Goldsmith's unrecorded score to Babe the Gallant Pig with Jeff in the archives at the Margaret Herrick Library, because that's something else I hope materializes someday with a Kickstarter or something.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that we'll be able to get back to the library, because when we were going to go back to look closer, there was COVID, so we couldn't.
Yeah.
So it's a first order of business, I think.
It'd be amazing if somebody realized, with an orchestral recording, Jerry's score, because he wrote like 90% of it.
It's beautiful.
Or perhaps there are new releases of obscure film or television scores coming up that Mike Matessino and Jeff Bond know about, but probably can't tell us too much about right now. But I guess what do we see as the things that might be coming in the future from both composers, even though Jerry's no longer with us?
But there's a built-in problem. As long as John is around to perform his own works, for the rest of us, we got to, well, why do we have to do it? Why should we do it? Bernstein's a good example. Most of us stayed away from doing Bernstein's music while he was alive and still doing it. A few of us did. I made a few recordings while he was around, but sometimes years have to pass before you can look at a different approach to the music. That would certainly be the case with John. I've recorded, I think, 7 of the concertos, maybe more, and those rely mostly on the soloists who bring different personalities than the people for the concertos were written. So that works really well. Jerry is ripe for the picking here. He'd be somebody very interesting if you sat down with musicians in a room, you put it on a disc, say, okay, who wrote that?
I have a question. Did you, in any of the works of Jerry's or John's that you may have done with orchestra on stage, have you done it to picture?
Well, I've done some of John's, but little frames. I've done other pictures as well, but not either Jerry's. I've wanted to do them, but I can only do so much.
Yeah, because I know that David has done a few of them.
He's done a great job. There are, again, a part of this is going to go to training. I can do it because I grew up in it. I know what it is. But most people, and it's sad that most of my colleagues really don't know what to do in terms of figuring out. I did a very interesting one last year. You all know Jeff Beal, I'm sure. And he did a television show for a series called Nightmares and Dreamscapes. And there was this 1 hour-long thing that had no dialogue, none at all. It was an hour-long, music all the way through. And I thought, this is perfect for doing in a concert format. Very difficult, really hard. But I had great fun with it. It had, what's his name? William Hurd, as a mobster who kills a toy shop owner. And it's about all the toys coming to life who go to assassinate the hitman. And it was brilliant. It was really great. It's worth checking out. It's just a terrific thing. I think we need to be creative now in terms of what we present to the public and what we present on disc or whatever medium we're going to have. The repertoire needs to open up in every field now at this time. It just needs to.
The infrastructure for moving forward is being kept from us right now, which is the concert hall, which is the idea of 1,000 people gather in one place and 60 to 100 musicians all sitting close together, making music. And right now it's very frustrating that that's been kept from us. And just looking at the people here, it's like, I miss going to David's rehearsals, and I miss running into Mike at Disney Hall, and I miss working with Bruce in his studio, and we're doing these great things. We took it all for granted. So there is a pathway forward, but we have to get through that part of it first. I think the concert hall is sort of the answer, because this explosion of the live to picture phenomenon is not only bringing the audiences in and exposing them to film music, but it's helping the orchestras, manage their seasons. It's increasing increasing subscriptions, and they can sort of build programs around that. So, and now the challenge is to have the audiences come and enjoy the music maybe without the picture, and then we can sort of expand their repertoire from there and bring more and more music.
Why not expand this in a different way? Here we are. We've been out of live performance for almost a year now. It's probably going to be another few months before this happens. Leanne can probably address this really well. Why don't we create new works? People who write for the media of film or television, but create works that are specifically premiered and done for the first time in front of a concert audience. New video presentations, things that are done that you don't get in the theater or at home. That's what I think has to be done. For me, it's not about looking back, okay, let's make up what we lost. No, let's go forward and create new avenues, new opportunities.
That's a really a beautiful way to look into the future through the eyes of such great composers like Jerry and John, and see perhaps a way through to go forward, which is something that I'm absolutely convinced that John still believes. And Jerry would agree definitely with such statements. So I really want to thank you all, guys, for attending this. I would go on for another hour probably. It's been such fun, such really instructive for me to listen to all of you. So I want to thank first Daniel for helping and bringing all of us together. Thank you, Daniel, for staying with us and listening, but mainly for bringing us all together.
Thank you, all of you.
I just want to say a direct hello to Leonard. I'm not sure that we ever met, but I played on so many sessions with your mom, and there's a lot of history there. So it's really neat to spend this time with you.
Michael, did I read somewhere that you played with Don Ellis?
I did.
Did you go on tour with him?
Not a little bit, yeah. When he first started his band, I kind of was interested in doing recordings with him, but I told him, because I was building a career in LA, I may have toured a little bit with him, and then I finally relinquished the job because he was wanting to do a lot more touring and I couldn't do it. But yes,
because he came to St. Louis once when I was just starting here, and he played in a high school, and I remember it was an unforgettable concert with the band. Unbelievable.
But Jerry loved the fact that Mike played with Ellis.
Well, that came because of kind of a sarcastic remark I made on a session that you and I were on. And it was the session that created a real relationship with Jerry and I, because it was just me working with him and his son Joel. There was a picture called Runaway, and it was like a synthesized orchestra, and there was no money and they couldn't do it traditionally. And he called and asked if I'd do him a favor and come do it. And we spent 3 days together. And basically, I had to play every stave of the orchestra from a pencil score of his, and he was turning pages. And there was a tremendous amount of metric, as there always is with Jerry, lots of meter changes. But for me, it seemed okay. It was we were doing it really kind of fluently and everything. And at one point, he looked at me, and I'd only worked with him a handful of times before that. We didn't know each other that well. And he says, "How can you do that? How can you do it so effortlessly?" He was kind of blown away. He says, "So how can you do that?" And I just said the first thing that came to mind, which was a joke. I said, "Well, I used to play in Don Ellis's band."
And that was it.
I get 5/4 and 3/4. And
hey, Mike, wasn't Alan Pasqua sitting next to you playing as well? The two
no,
of you?
He preceded me. Jerry had called me in because he felt like he needed to have me there, but Alan was done by then. The end of the story is that Jerry loved that remark and loved the whole idea of it. So we'd be on a movie and he'd introduce me to the director. He says, "I want you to meet my pianist. You've been hearing his great playing. He used to play with Don Ellis." It became like a running joke. And at one point I wanted to have a t-shirt made and bring it to one of the sessions, but I never took it that far.
It reminds me, I remember going to see Capricorn one in the theater, and I spent the first 10 minutes trying to figure out the time signature changes. I missed the whole setup for the film.
Well, that's a pretty good example of why we should go on for another hour if we could. Really, guys, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart that this was so successful. Thank you very much.
Leonard, we should definitely recommend everyone to check out Leonard Slatkin, the wonderful, we talked about Jerry Goldsmith's album. This is Leonard Slatkin with John Williams, Mark Paskanov, the violin concerto, flute concerto, as something you should all seek out if you haven't got that album. Produced by George Korngold, no less.
That's right.
With the LSO.
I'll just go out by saying that we still miss Jerry, and happy birthday, John, who will now have more candles on his cake than there are keys on a piano.
That's true. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
It's been
Thank you so
a great
much.
pleasure.